So part 4 of the revelation and reaction to divine power. You have come with me here for 4 parts. If you've been following along here, the titles have been very redundant. It keeps saying the revelation and reaction to divine power in the bulletin. But this is it. This is the final part. We're really coming, though, to the end of a section. And the reason I kept using that title is because it binds together this section of the book of Mark. I always, as much as I want to hone in, zero in on certain passages, I really think it's so important for us to know the big picture. I find, as someone who studies, but also someone who teaches, that it's really important for our understanding. It's kind of like when you zoom in on Google Maps, you can see the roads, and you can see, but if all you do is look at those individual roads, it can still be very confusing to get your bearings until you zoom out and kind of see how it is all laid out. That's helpful for me. Maybe for some of you, even looking at the Google Maps from a zoomed out view isn't that helpful. But I do think when it comes to learning things, zooming in and zooming out is very helpful. So I thank you for bearing with me. I know last week we covered a lot of verses, and I know it takes endurance to sit and to consider all of these things. But today I have 2 main points. As we look at these verses in Mark 6, we're really going to be thinking about how it all ties together, this passage. Mark chapter 4, verse 35, but now we're coming to the end of it in Mark chapter 1, verses 6 through 6. 2 main points: greater power shown and greater power rejected. And then as we think about those things, we'll also consider application to our lives. Number 1, greater power shown. Well, this is really just a summary of what we've already looked at. We have seen the power that Jesus demonstrated over nature, the storm on the sea, commanding the wind and the waves, and the storm ceased. We see Jesus' power over the legion of demons. A man possessed by many demons is delivered by the word of Jesus. We see Jesus' power over a long-term illness. All a woman has to do is in faith reach out and touch the hem of Jesus' garment, and she is restored from a 12-year-long battle with bleeding, a hemorrhage. And then we have finally seen Jesus' power over death itself, as the ruler of the synagogue, Jairus, came to Jesus and asked him to heal his daughter. Sadly, from Jairus' perspective, he thought all hope was lost because his daughter came completely into death. But Jesus, in his power, said, "She is not dead, she is sleeping." From the power of the divine Son, even death itself is just temporary. And Jesus raised this young girl from the dead. Jesus' power is shown over the storm, the demons, illness, and death itself. God has made his presence and power known. And I know as we read these things, it is easy for us to say, yes, I've heard these things, Jesus did these things. But remember, God is continuing to make his presence and power known. Jesus is the ultimate expression of that. But we see even today that God has shown himself all around us. Paul says in Romans 1:19, what can be known about God is plain to people because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. Do we have really an excuse as humans to deny that there is a creator? No, there is no excuse. His power, his divinity is shown in all creation around us. Paul, in witnessing at the Areopagus, as he was in Athens, declared that God who made the world and everything in it, being the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined the allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet, he is actually not far from each one of us. God is present. We can find him. And what does he go on to say to these Greeks? In him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own poets have said. Now he's actually quoting their writers. Even people in your context, Paul says to these people in Greece, Athens, have written about this expression of divinity and an understanding of, what does it say here at the end? We are indeed his offspring. All people know deep down this concept of divinity, of divine presence. Recently, I don't know why, but I was thinking about skunks. Maybe because we have them a lot here where we live. But skunks, I just was thinking about this. They're not our favorite creatures necessarily, but they have this ability to create a stench and to spray that for protection. And it's just one of the examples, as I was thinking about this, of how do you think of a skunk and what it is able to do, as weird as it is and maybe as repulsive as it is, and not think that that was designed. There was a meme recently that I saw with a robot hand, and the meme was showing in one frame a robot hand, and the reaction that people have about the robot hand. Look at the amazing design of that hand. And in the next frame was a human hand. And the reaction to that is, that just got here by chance. As microbiologist Michael Behe tells in one of his books, it's called Darwin's Black Box. I read it years ago, and this illustration always stuck with me. He looks at things on the microbiological level as a scientist. And one of those things, of course, that we could think about would be DNA. And the amazing amount of information that is stored in DNA. And he uses this illustration of having some people over for a Sunday afternoon time of getting together and playing the game of Scrabble. And after one of the games, you go off to take a break into the kitchen. And when you come back out, the Scrabble letters have been put back in the box. Some of them are face up, some are face down, and it doesn't faze you until you look down and you see that the letters spell out, "Take us out to dinner, cheapskates." And when you see that, do you think that's coincidence? The natural reaction is to look at the information and say, that was intentional. Intelligence put that information there in the way that it's structured. And by the way, Scrabble letters, that information is next to nothing compared to DNA. Are we intelligently designed? I think that's an understatement. We can't even fathom the intelligence of how we've been designed. God has made his divine power and presence known. The people in Jesus' day were seeing this firsthand because the ultimate expression of God's power and presence is in Jesus. But what were people doing? They were reacting in different ways. And ultimately, we come now to this place where we see kind of a fundamental rejection of Jesus. And where does it take place? It says Jesus left there. He's been near the Sea of Galilee. He goes to his hometown. This is about 25 miles southwest of Capernaum on the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee. 25 miles southwest of Capernaum. And the population of Nazareth, it's going to blow you away, around this time probably had about 500 people. And if it sounds obscure and small, that's because that's exactly what it was. It was a nothing place. And he comes to Nazareth with his disciples. And on the Sabbath day, he begins to teach in the synagogue. And we're going to see the reaction that people have to his teaching. Already we've seen when Jesus has been at home that his family didn't have the greatest reaction. Remember, some people who were close to him were saying, he's out of his mind. There is an obstacle for us as humans where we have preconceived ideas about people, don't we? Especially thinking of someone in their hometown. We have a bias based on our first perception. You might think of how people who knew you when you were little have a certain conception of who you are. I know years and years and years after I was home, still knew people that if they saw me, and I'd go back years later to my hometown, if they were some of the people that knew me in church, they would call me Timmy. Little Timmy. No matter how not little I was. I mean, I am pretty little, but they still thought of me that way. And someone who maybe knew you before you entered into a certain capacity, they can have a hard time thinking of you differently. Well, as Jesus is coming to his hometown, they have these preconceived ideas. But he begins to teach in the synagogue, and they're amazed. It says that they are astonished at his teaching. He's not someone they're expecting to be able to teach in the way that he's teaching. And their reaction in astonishment is not really a positive thing. We actually see there's a negativity to it. They ask, where did this man get these things? He's not a student of a famous rabbi or from a prestigious family. So they're questioning the source of his teaching. And we can understand this when we think about who we're going to listen to. Whether we're conscious of it or not, we will ask the question, well, what are their credentials? Should I really listen to this person? That's kind of what they're asking here. But what it shows is the condition of their heart. Because rather than considering the content of his teaching itself and the power that he is demonstrating, they're dismissing it with these kinds of questions. Like, well, where did he get his teaching? Then they bring up his family occupation. We don't know where he's gotten his training, and look at this person that his family is part of. Look at his family occupation. Isn't this the carpenter? And the word for carpenter is tekton. And one commentator says that this is someone who could work with wood, metal, or stone. He could be a builder, a mason, or a carpenter. In Jesus' Palestinian context, it probably denoted a woodworking handyman. He would have the skill to do almost anything, from crafting plows and yokes to making pieces of furniture, cupboards, stools, and benches, to erecting small buildings, particularly making the beams, window lattices, doors, and bolts. So he's just a hands-on woodworking person. We have people like that around here, don't we? And his townspeople are saying, we know him. He's just this everyday hands-on worker. We know his family. And they go on to even bring up who his family members are. This is Mary's son, the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, Simon, and his sisters. Aren't they here with us too? Jesus' family is well known. And it's interesting, we don't know exactly why they bring up the fact that he's the son of Mary. Typically, you would bring up that you're the son of the Father in their culture. So some people believe that they're actually insulting him. That they're saying, well, maybe he's actually an illegitimate son. But whatever the case may be, they're clearly pointing out that Jesus is just someone that they know as a regular person who has a family that are living among them. And by the way, it's also very interesting to note here that Jesus did have brothers and sisters. Now, some people will say, well, no, those words don't have to mean brothers and sisters. And the truth is, people who study the Greek language would say, actually, that is naturally what those words mean. And the most natural way to take this passage is Jesus had brothers and sisters. And if that confuses you or you have any questions about that, you can come see me after the service. Because some traditions say that Jesus did not biologically have brothers and sisters through Mary. But the scripture does indicate that he did. The point being, though, that Jesus is being looked at here from a purely physical perspective. It reminds me in the Old Testament of the story of the prophet Samuel, who is sent to anoint a new king over Israel in place of Saul. And he is sent to the house of Jesse. He goes to a sacrifice and he asks Jesse and the sons to come to the sacrifice. And when he stands before the first son, he's looking, who is God going to lead him to anoint as king? And he looks at the first son and he says, surely, this tall, strong man before me, I'm embellishing a little bit, but I'm sure this is what he's thinking. This has to be the king. And what does God say to Samuel in that moment? Do not look at his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees, not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Samuel goes on to reject not only the first son, but the next one, the next one, the next one. He goes through 7 sons of Jesse, and God says none of them. And Samuel's at a loss. He says, do you have any other sons? And Jesse says, oh yes, there is one. He's out in the field tending the sheep. And Samuel said, well, go get him. And that son was David, who became the epitome of the kings of Israel. Well, people continue to look on the outward appearance, while God looks deeper. And the people of Jesus' day were looking at the outward appearance. Paul says something very important about this. He says, from now on then, we do not know anyone in a purely human way. Even if we have known Christ in a purely human way, yet now we know him. We no longer know him in this way. That phrase, purely human way, that the more literal rendering is knowing Christ according to the flesh. But the idea there is people can look at Jesus and they can write him off. They can look at him from a purely human perspective and say, no, he can't be the Christ. But Paul says, when you see, when your eyes are open from beyond that merely human perspective, and you have a true openness, you see Jesus for who he really is. And he's not just what we see from a pure human perspective. Well, the people are just looking at this from a purely human perspective, and they're writing Jesus off as just one of the people that they've known all their lives, in a family they're very familiar with. And it goes from being astonished at his teaching to questioning to then it says that they actually took offense at him. That's the end of verse 3. They took offense at him. Their questioning turned to outright offense. And what does Jesus respond to as they're being offended by him? He says, and this is really a proverb, a prophet is not without honor except in his own town. A prophet is not without honor except in his own town. That's a saying that they likely had at that time, and we have sayings similar to this in our day. We have the saying that says, familiarity breeds contempt. And David Garland says that the expert at a conference is usually the one who has come from the farthest away. I've experienced this to some degree because having traveled all the way over to Kenya, across the ocean in the African continent, I can tell you, when you travel that far, people are really interested in what you have to say. But when you're in your home area, not always as much. Well, Jesus takes this statement and he also adds more pointedly, prophet is not without honor except in his own town, among his relatives, and in his own household. Jesus is pointing out here, it has gotten very personal for him, even Even among his own relatives and household, he is met with rejection. John points this out before one of the Jewish festivals. Jesus was talking with his brothers. And John talks about this little kind of a quibble they have. And John states that at this time, even his brothers didn't believe in him. And so it says here, as Jesus is responding to them in this way, verse 5 now, he could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. No mighty work could be done there. But you notice it says that some people were still healed. When you read this, some people come up with the question, why could he not heal people? And one thing that I think is important to note, not only in this passage but throughout Scripture, is that Jesus' power is not dependent on any person's faith. Let me say that again. Jesus' power is not dependent on any person's faith. Here, even though the town rejects him, he still is able to heal people. And in many other places in Scripture, you'll see even when people didn't necessarily exhibit faith, he was able to do miracles. It didn't matter whether people had faith or not. Actually, that teaching that you have to have faith in order for something to happen kind of puts the responsibility on the person, right? Rather than on the person who's able to do the miracle. And that is very often something that you could expect a scam artist to do. I'm reminded of the movie that we like to watch sometimes in our house, Pete's Dragon. And there are these two men in the movie Pete's Dragon. This is the movie I'm referring to is made, I think, in the late 1970s. It's a really sweet movie. And the two characters in this movie that kind of stand out a little bit in my mind are these two men who travel from town to town, and they trick people into buying their medicine. But what do they have to do to get people to buy the medicine? They have to get them to exhibit faith on some level, to dupe them, right? Because how are they going to spend their money unless they first establish this? So they actually bring out the one of the men actually pretends to be sick. And the other man uses the medicine to heal the supposedly sick man. And by garnering that type of trust, he's able to get people to give them money. The irony of this, actually, is that they had been to the town before, and already people had seen that these were scam artists. But they kept getting duped again and again. But that's what happens when people are told that it's dependent on you. You're the one who has to make this happen. So why could Jesus do no miracle? It has nothing to do with whether he had the ability to do miracles. He could do miracles all over the place, regardless of people's faith. But this is a question of commission. Why would God do a miracle? And Jesus is not going to do a miracle in this place. He couldn't do it in terms of his mission. God does not owe anyone a miracle. And we do see in places where people in Scripture say, well, if God would just do this, if God would just do that. And the truth is, God doesn't have to do anything that we demand. And even if God does, that will not bring a person to faith. No matter what Jesus did, you can tell that no matter what Jesus did, some people did not believe. God owes no one a miracle. And so God, in his providence and in his mission to this situation, would not do a mighty work there. Jesus' reaction, though, to this is amazement in verse 6. He was amazed at their unbelief. He marveled at their unbelief. This is really interesting because one other place that we read about Jesus marveling, or another situation, is when a man, I believe it's a centurion, comes to Jesus for healing. And the centurion says, you don't even have to come. Just say the word, and I know, Jesus, that you're able to do what you have the power to do. And when Jesus listens to this man, he marvels and says to those who followed him, truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. And it says there, he was amazed at what? At this centurion's faith. Whereas here, Jesus is amazed and marveling at their lack of faith. I think it really brings up something that I can relate to as well, that I've been surprised at times by who does believe and who doesn't believe. I've been surprised at times. There will be people that from this standpoint that we're looking at here, you say they have every reason to believe, and yet they don't believe. And then other people you think, there's no way. And yet God does a work in their life, and they become a believer. It does really amaze us. Jesus, in his humanity, expresses this. He's marveled. How can they not believe? They have every reason to. So let's think about this in application. There's a few things here that I think are really important to dwell on. And the first is that God does not work in ways that we expect. Jesus, from a human standpoint, was a lowly person. Even though he, being in the form of God in his preexistence, had the glory of heaven, he came to earth, not just as a man, but as a poor man. And not just to a lowly area of the world, but the lowest area within that place. Even his own townspeople are kind of acknowledging this. One of the people Jesus encountered, a man named Nathanael, when he heard where Jesus, the Messiah, was from, he said, Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth? And that statement, that reaction of Nathanael seems to be almost what we're hearing here, the inferiority complex of the entire town. They're almost saying it about themselves. This is supposed to be a great teacher who comes from our town? We need to remember that like the people of Jesus' day, we also today can display the same bias. People today might say, well, isn't Jesus just a teacher from a pre-modern, unenlightened era? And when we think about that, what we're really saying is, we are the enlightened ones, right? We are so enlightened. And look at around us. Aren't we so enlightened? I mean, we would never do anything that you could look at and say, that's stupid. Or maybe that's not the case, is it? When you look around, even in our society today, we see that we have the same condition as people 2,000 years ago. And we do foolish things. So there's a bias there, but what we need to do is look for God in the unexpected places. We need to look for God to be at work in the unexpected places. Another thing here along with that is that, in a sense, God is too near for these people. Jesus is God with us, Emmanuel. But in a sense, he's too near. They're just not able to even fathom what's happening here. And it is easy for us to think and judge based on what we think we already know. I'm reminded in the Old Testament of a man who, his name was Naaman. He was a commander of an army, the army of Aram. And he was told by a young Israelite woman who had been captured that he should go to the prophet in Israel because Naaman was suffering from leprosy, this skin disease. And Naaman wanted desperately to be healed. And so he says, okay, I'll try. And he goes to his king and he says, I want to go to Israel and I want to be healed. I've been told by this Israelite young woman I can be healed. And the king says, okay, I'll write a letter to the other king and we'll send you there. And when the king sends the letter to the king of Israel, the king of Israel is actually scared. He thinks that the other king's trying to pick a fight with him. And then the prophet comes and he says, you don't have to be scared. God has a prophet in Israel and he can bring healing to this man. So Naaman goes to the prophet's place, Elisha, and he asks the prophet, okay, what do I need to do? And Elisha says, you need to wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan River, and then your flesh, your skin will be restored, and you will be cleansed. And what is Naaman's reaction? It says he went away angry, and he said, I thought that he would surely come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord as God, and wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. See, he wanted a big, showy thing to happen. That's what a prophet's supposed to do. Not tell me to go wash in a river. And then he says this. I love the bias here. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than any of the waters of Israel? We've got better rivers where I'm from. Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? So he turned off and went away in a rage. Then Naaman's servants went to him and said, my father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, and there it is, he was expecting he had to do something great. If they had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, wash and be cleansed? Just do the little thing. Okay. So he went down and he dipped himself in the Jordan River 7 times, as the man of God told him. And guess what happened? His flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. We have to get rid of our preconceptions. Our notions that God has to work in the way that we think he will work. And sometimes God is doing things, and if we would just open our eyes, we would see it. Perhaps the signs of what God is doing are right in front of us. But what are we? We're like Naaman. No, it has to be some great thing I'm not expecting. No. The opportunity's right there. Just listen to what God is saying and respond to what he says, and you'll see it. Jesus was right there. And yet his own people, who really should have been the most willing to say, yes, clearly something miraculous is taking place, because he's so lowly and came from our town, how could he do these things but by the power of God? Instead they say, no, that couldn't possibly it. Has to be someone prestigious. Has to be someone who does things that we're expecting him to do. But what do we also see in this account? That when Jesus teaches, it is an astonishing message. They're astonished. That's their first response. They're astonished. I love what the prophet Isaiah says. In Isaiah chapter 8, verse 14, that the Lord shall become a sanctuary, right? That's a place of refuge. But to both the houses of Israel, a stone to strike and a rock to stumble over, and a snare and a trap for the inhabitants of Israel. This is the same Lord who brings about 2 different results. To some, he's a sanctuary, and to others, he's a stumbling stone and a rock of offense. And we saw that today, that it got to the point where these people who knew him were actually offended by him. Guess what? The message of Jesus Christ that we give today is still an astonishing message that still brings about these kinds of responses. Some will have faith, and listen, I know I encourage you to invite people to church and to share your faith. Guess what? Not everybody is going to respond well. Jesus himself had people respond negatively. And in some sense, that is an encouragement, isn't it? That if you are sharing about Jesus and someone's kind of pushing it away and rejecting, I tried to give someone a card this week of our church. They didn't want it. That's fine. But it's encouragement. There's nothing wrong with you. People didn't accept Jesus either. But listen, people's responses ultimately are in God's hands. And I can tell you this, I just saw this on Twitter, X, this week. A man whose name on Twitter is From Darwin to Jesus. And he actually said this week. He said, when you're talking to people about Jesus, be patient. It took me years to go from being an atheist to being a believer. But today, that man is a witness for Jesus Christ. But when people first started talking to him, he didn't listen. So don't give up. Jesus, he demonstrates for us that we have a message and we give it regardless of how people respond. Which leads finally to this. As we think about Jesus standing in the presence, teaching, and the question is asked, who is this man? That's a question that's been brought up in the book of Mark. Who is this man? Either he is just a man, which is a reaction of unbelief. And I will say, I think when I think of that phrase, just a man, there's actually a song written years ago in a musical that's talking about Jesus. And that's actually one of the lines of the characters in the song. She's singing about Jesus, and she says, he's just a man. He's just a man. That's from a human standpoint, right? He's just a man. That's a reaction of unbelief. Listen, God does give us a real choice. He gives us evidence, but it is also still possible for us as humans to find reasons to deny it. Because no matter how much evidence we have, belief is a matter of the heart. So who is this man? Is he just a man? That's unbelief. Or is he the Son of God? Which is the reaction of faith. As we've witnessed here, people are having different reactions to Jesus. In his hometown, it's largely rejection. But we have seen that people have different reactions to Jesus. And what we have seen through the writer, the inspired writer Mark, is that Jesus has power over nature, power over the demonic world, power over illness, and power over death. I think if we're honest, we know the answer to that question. He's not just a man. He is the Son of God. The signs of his presence and power are all around us. They're in Scripture, and we see it at work today, if we have eyes to see. Do you believe?